So, you've heard that in this room, on the 1st of July, 1999, the Scottish Parliament reconvened after a recess of nearly 300 years. So this is why we chose this space as our venue for the event today. For this reason, we think about the architecture and sense of space in this place that was linked with those first steps into what a devolved legislature for Scotland would look like. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from our speakers and our contributors and from you in our discussions today. I regret to say that, unfortunately, Lord Wallace has not been well, and this has meant at short notice he's not been able to be with us today. I spoke with Jim yesterday, and he's extremely sorry not to be able to be here, and I'm sure you'll want to join me in wishing him all the best for a swift and speedy recovery. He has offered some remarks and reflections, and Clare will read those out shortly on his behalf. Later, we'll also hear from those who are involved in the work of the Devolution campaign and links to the work of the Constitutional Convention. We'll hear from those involved in the life of the Church in 1999 to help paint a picture of the atmosphere and the relationships and what they were like in the early days of the Parliament. We'll hear from thinkers and researchers on how things feel now and how they might look in the future. And we'll hear from some of the contemporary practitioners sharing their perspectives on how their activity is developed today and how relationships are built. The Scottish Church's Parliamentary Office, or SCPO for short, was established by the churches in Scotland in 1999, in time for the first elections, and you'll hear more of this later. At the time, it was a physical office with a distinct team and remit. Over the years, the SCPO has adapted and evolved in relation to how Parliament and the churches have worked. It's no longer, strictly speaking, an office, but is more a network of fellowship and relationships and a forum to share ideas. Today, our work is to build good relations between Scottish churches, the Scottish and UK parliaments and governments. The churches which work together through the SCPO see this as a sign of ecumenical commitment and to enable ecumenical cooperation. If you want to find out more about the work of the SCPO, please talk to me during one of the breaks or lunches today. The SCPO network is at the heart of our work and relationships. This group is open to anyone working for a Scottish church or Christian organisation on parliamentary issues. A monthly meeting considers key issues on the parliamentary agenda, where information, ideas, intelligence, and so on can be shared, and contacts can be made for deepening partnership and fellowship. And the network is regularly updated with information and notices relevant to this work, and many of the members of the network are also here today. I'd also like to make a special mention because later we'll hear from the Reverend Gethin Rees, who is sitting at the back. Welcome, Gethin. Gethin is the policy officer for Catine Churches Together in Wales. Gethin does for the Welsh churches what the SCPO does for Scottish churches. And I think the contrast and comparison between our two parliaments and nations will be very useful to challenge and inspire us for our future work. And Gethin, I think you have travelled the furthest to be here, so you are especially welcome. I'd like to make a wee comment on ecumenism. It has been said to me that the 1990s were a time of ecumenical optimism. The Swanwick Declaration of 1990 was followed by an uptick in a hopeful vision for the churches working together across the British Isles, especially in areas of service and resourcing. It was in this context and culture that the SCPO and the Welsh counterpart in Catine were formed. For one reason or another, I think it is fair to say that this spirit of optimism has not lasted to our current time. I think I'd like to pose the question, if the moment of devolution were to happen today, would our churches seek to or want to work together? Is the continued existence of the SCPO something important to hold on to, while so much else ecumenical becomes looser or less institutional? Or is it time for the SCPO to further adapt and evolve? What is the right role for the Church of Scotland in supporting this work, when other churches at a Scottish or UK level are staffing their own work on parliamentary issues and agendas? How can the Church of Scotland both convene the SCPO network, but also have its own distinct policy, witness, and pastoral relationship with the Parliament? These are some of the practical issues I have to think about every day, and so I hope today will be a chance for you to explore with me how this work might develop in the next few years. What is your vision? Where will we be in the next 25 years? What would the theme of a conference in this hall be like in 2049? I mentioned earlier that the choice of this space was deliberate as the meeting point for the Parliament in 1999. It is perhaps one of the most remarkable connections between the Church of Scotland and the modern Scottish Parliament. You might have noticed in the corridor behind me, the floor, it's known as the black and white corridor for the shape and colour of the black diamond floor tiles. When the General Assembly meets here, the black and white corridor is used for those behind-the-scenes conversations to negotiate an agreed wording of a motion or to plan some clever intervention in the debate. So too, the black and white corridor was used for this purpose when the Parliament met here, a convenient place for MSPs and advisors to slip out to confer or confront opponents. If you have the chance to visit the Holyrood Parliament campus and are able to take a tour or be accompanied behind the scenes, you'll find that they too still have a black and white corridor, a space just outside the debating chamber that has been floored with black and white tiles. A design feature which remembers their time in a different space. The physical connection between the Church of Scotland and the Scottish Parliament does, however, go much further back than 1999. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the Scottish Parliament met a few hundred metres from where we sit in the chamber of the Court of Session, which was then situated in the central aisle of St Giles Cathedral. Charles I, that king who had so much trouble with the English Parliament, ordered the construction of a new meeting place for the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh. And the result was Parliament House, adjacent to St Giles. The king, who sought to impose unwanted reforms on the Church of Scotland, still believed that the Scottish Parliament must have a permanent home of suitable grandeur and significance. And in the construction of Parliament House, there was still a connection to the Church of Scotland. 3 manses belonging to ministers of St Giles had to be demolished to make space for it to be built. So what does this mean for us here today? Perhaps nothing. Bit of trivia for you. But if the imprint of stones and wood and glass and tiles can leave a memory on the Parliament and on the notion and on the nation and its sense of self, can there be a similar imprint in the intangible legacy of the Church's work, the values and teachings of Jesus Christ? How does the truth of the gospel inform the decisions taken by today's MSPs? How is the experience and understanding of the Church in its many different traditions and cultures, in local communities and through international connections, influencing and inspiring all those who work in and around Parliament? If a black and white corridor floor can be reconstructed, is it possible to reconstruct a sense of public service, truthfulness, decency, and creativity? At the end of our conference today, we'll hold a short act of worship. This will use as a theme the 4 MACE values, the words etched onto the mace used in the Scottish Parliament, the ideals that we hope our politicians and all our leaders will aspire to: wisdom, justice, integrity, compassion. This act of worship will be a thanksgiving for the journey that we have been on and a recommitment for the future. I invite you all to join us after our day of thinking and sharing. Thank you. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Lord Wallace is very sorry not to be able to be here with us at the event, but Clare has kindly offered to read out his remarks. Jim was elected as MP for Orkney and Shetland in 1983 and became leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats in 1992. He was elected as the first MSP for Orkney in 1999, and as party leader negotiated the formation of the Labour Liberal Democrat coalition government, in which he served as Deputy First Minister from May 1999 until June 2005, during which time he had responsibilities including justice and enterprise and lifelong learning. Jim did not seek re-election in the 2007 Scottish Parliament election, and later that year he was appointed to the House of Lords as Baron Wallace of Tankerness. Following the UK Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition created after the 2010 general election, Jim was appointed Advocate General for Scotland in the UK government. Jim has been an elder of long standing at St Magnus Cathedral in Kirkwall and served as moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland from 2021 to 2022. Let's hear Jim's words now.
Hello. You'll need quite a lot of imagination to just close your eyes if that will help. These are Jim's words, but they only arrived, well, very recently, a few minutes ago, really. So I've had a read through, so I hope I'll do them as much justice as possible. But please forgive me. Okay. I have a vivid memory of the service held in St Andrew's and St George's Church, where the Reverend Graham Blount was commissioned as the first parliamentary officer of the Scottish Church's Parliamentary Office, the SCPO. I had been invited to attend as a leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, but as I tried to find somewhere to park, I reckoned I was going to be cutting it fine to arrive in time for the start of the service. No matter, I could slip in and sit in a pew at the back. However, on arrival at the church door, with about 1 minute to spare, I was grabbed by the minister, Alan McLennan, and told, gently but firmly, where I had to stand in the procession due to enter the sanctuary. No one had explained to me beforehand that I had a role to play. Thankfully, not a speaking role, and I was sufficiently familiar with the Presbyterian tradition not to be daunted when it came to extending the right hand of fellowship with Graham. Over the ensuing years, I became well acquainted with Graham and the work of the SCPO, and after standing down from the Scottish Parliament, I became the Church of Scotland's representative on the interdenominational steering group of the SCPO. It was an exciting time in Scottish politics, and I dare say in the relations between Church and Parliament. We were about to embark on a new venture, the Scottish Parliament, which many of us had campaigned for over many years, and which the churches, through the Constitutional Convention, had not only campaigned for, but had contributed in shaping. The individual contributions of people like Canon Kenyon Wright of the Scottish Episcopal Church and the Reverend Norman Shanks from the Church of Scotland were valuable and considerable. There was a sense, if I can borrow from Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, that everything old had passed away and see, everything was becoming new. Perhaps we were carried away with the prospect of this new parliament, but in reality, as church men and women, we were not really trailblazers. During my time in Westminster, I, along with other MPs, received the report of the Church and Nation Committee, and on occasions we would be lobbied by the Kirk on specific issues. Latterly, the convener of the Church and Nation Committee would come to Westminster and meet with the respective party groups and have very worthwhile discussions on current national and international issues. But I am very conscious that in the immediate post-war World War II years, The Kirk's engagement in the state of the nation had undergone a sea change. That's not to say that Christian witness in the political life of the nation only started in 1945, but it was staggering to reflect that during the economic crises and mass unemployment of the 1930s, the General Assembly was far more preoccupied by the size of Scotland's Catholic population and what to do about it. It was against that background that the Kirk established a commission under the chairmanship of Professor John Bailey. The commission's report, God's Will for the Church and Nation, stated, "The Bible teaches clearly, and the truth of this teaching the Holy Spirit witnesses in every sensitive Christian conscience, that the commandments of God extend to every sphere of human action, and there is no part of our life into which Christ does not desire an entrance." The Bailey Commission's report provided a powerful wake-up call and spur to the Church of Scotland and influenced and nurtured people in all parties to engage in the political life of the nation. Nor was it the preserve of the Church of Scotland. The strong ecumenical tide which was flowing also identified common cause among denominations in political action. I'm sure many of us were inspired by the ideal of establishing a new parliament in a country which already had established democratic institutions, an opportunity to remedy the shortcomings of a system which seldom found sufficient time for Scottish legislation and created a backlog of necessary reforms. The Constitutional Convention had drafted a blueprint for the Parliament, including a more proportional electoral system, and it was to the credit of the incoming Labour government that it honoured the agreement, even if it wasn't to their political advantage, a rare example of political self-sacrifice. It was also worth recording that the new government got off the mark. Legislation to enact a referendum was among the first bills introduced after the 1997 election, and it's worth recording that the referendum took place just over 4 months after the election. I must admit that my party had opposed the two-question referendum. It was a breach of our convention agreement, and the shades of the 1979 referendum still haunted us. We couldn't let this opportunity slip through our hands. In the event, the referendum campaign was overshadowed by the tragic death of Princess Diana, and by agreement, the respective sides suspended the campaign until after the funeral. That left 4 days of campaigning before referendum day. 4 manic days of debates and campaign events, and in the event, well rewarded by positive outcomes to both questions. In retrospect, I was wrong to be sceptical about the idea of the referendum. We spent hours in the convention wrestling with questions as to how we might entrench the Parliament. In the event, the Scottish Parliament was entrenched by popular mandate, which may not have had a strict constitutional effect, but had profound practical effect. There then followed the Scotland Bill to work out the details. Many hours of debate, mostly constructive. And in parallel, a constitutional steering group under the chairmanship of Henry MacLeish was established to consider some of the practical workings of the new legislature, including exciting issues such as standing orders, but also, significantly, what values it ought to embody. The report recommended 4 founding principles. The Scottish Parliament should embody and reflect the sharing of power between the people of Scotland, the legislators and the Scottish Executive. The Scottish Executive should be accountable to the Scottish Parliament, and the Parliament and Executive should be accountable to the people of Scotland. The Scottish Parliament should be accessible, open, responsive, and develop procedures which make possible a participative approach to the development, consideration, and scrutiny of policy and legislation. And finally, the Scottish Parliament, in its operations and its appointments, should recognise the need to promote equal opportunities for all. These principles were subsequently endorsed by the Parliament in its early days. I shall reflect later on whether these have been honoured. With some key building blocks in place, what was needed was a building and elected members to populate it. A controversial proposal to build a new Parliament building on an old brewery site at Holyrood was brought forward and led to several years of controversy. But in the meantime, agreement was reached with the Church of Scotland that the Parliament could occupy the General Assembly building where this event is taking place today. I have memories of this hall, both as a former MSP and as a former moderator of the General Assembly. The election date was set for the 6th of May 1999. For me, the liberating feature of the 1999 Scottish election campaign was that after years of fighting elections where the constitutional issue was never far away, it was now possible to focus on issues such as education, housing, transport, health. We sought a Scottish Parliament not as an end in itself, but as a means to the end of serving Scotland's people and communities better, not least through addressing the people's priorities. In the event, the election, as predicted, did not produce a majority government, and I was quickly engaged in talks with Donald Dewar and his Labour colleagues to see if we could establish a coalition government. Donald suggested we should meet on the Saturday after the election in what was then the Secretary of State's official residence, Bute House. Donald had written out 4 sides of A4 for a possible policy deal. On the Lib Dem side, I'd commissioned a colleague to distill a possible policy programme from our manifesto, and my new Scottish parliamentary colleagues agreed the 28-page policy document when we met on the Saturday morning after the election. In the event, that formed the basis for the negotiations, which then ensued. We arranged for small groups from both parties to go through the manifestos and identify areas of common ground. Where there was divergence, these were put in square brackets to be resolved by the principal negotiating teams. I recall one meeting where David alighted on a particular policy on which there was no concurrence and said, "What liberal nonsense is this?" To which I replied, "I think you'll find that comes from the Labour manifesto." In fairness, he laughed wholeheartedly. A programme for government was eventually agreed, and we could get down to the business of government and parliament. And Donald Dewar undoubtedly set the tone for this new parliament when he spoke on the opening day in this hall in the presence of the late Queen Elizabeth. Among a number of memorable quotes, he said, "We are fallible, we will make mistakes, but we will never lose sight of what brought us here. The striving to do right by the people of Scotland, to respect their priorities, to better their lot, and to contribute to the common weal. And today there is a new voice in the land, the voice of a democratic parliament, a voice to shape Scotland, a voice for the future." That was the political background to which the Parliament and the politics of Scotland subsequently unfolded. That was the political background in which the newly established Scottish Church's Parliamentary Office would work and try to influence policy and legislation from a Christian perspective. In some respects, there was an open door. Many MSPs were people of faith or had been influenced by the legacy of the Bailey Commission. The first substantive debate in the Scottish Parliament was on the subject of prayers. It's still worth a read to see how seriously MSPs from all parties addressed the issue of whether prayers should be said before plenary sessions of the Parliament. There was a strong sense that, unlike the Anglican monopoly at Westminster, they should be interdenominational, indeed multi-faith prayers. My late colleague, Donald Gorrie, even proposed some form of proportional representation. The motion that this Parliament agrees in principle for prayers to be held on a non-denominational basis at the start of each plenary session of the Parliament was carried by 69 votes to 17, with 37 abstentions. And in October 1999, Graham Blount, as the Scottish Church's parliamentary officer, delivered the first time for reflection. Graham certainly echoed the sense of purpose which had driven many of us along as we embarked on this new venture. We pray for our Parliament, offering our faith and our vision that this may be a place where folk can come, where they have no one else to turn to, a place of listening and of healing and of hope. We pray for one another, for folk we see as friends, rivals, colleagues and opponents, aware of the pressures and the failings and the possibilities we share. But it was also the case that, however welcoming, the churches were not going to be accorded special privileges. One of the principles enunciated by the consultative steering group was that the Scottish Parliament should be accessible, open, responsive, and develop procedures which make a possible participative approach to the development, consideration, and scrutiny of policy and legislation. On that basis, the SCPO had to make its case along with others. But in fairness to Graham and his successors, not only did the SCPO disseminate information about the Parliament and its work, but made cogent representations on a number of issues. One of the drawbacks, however, was if the different denominations couldn't speak with a united voice. In the first year of the Parliament, a great storm was raised over the Executive's proposal to repeal what was colloquially known as Section 2A, a measure which had been introduced by Mrs. Thatcher's government to outlaw any teaching or reference in schools to matters related to homosexuality. There was not exactly unanimity among the church voices. Another early issue was the possible inclusion of a question on religion in the upcoming 2001 census, for which I had ministerial responsibility. In the year 2000, the Cabinet voted against the inclusion of a religion question in the 2001 census. It was a rare and possibly the only occasion when we raised our hands in a vote. By a narrow majority of one, we resolved not to include a religion question, with Donald Dewar commenting that as a cultural Presbyterian, he wasn't sure how he would answer. I was not readily persuaded that the answers would provide any meaningful information which would guide future delivery of public services. I had a very difficult time trying to justify the decision before the Equal Opportunities Committee. Indeed, so unpersuasive was I that I had to bring in the legislation to meet the committee's will. That was a good example of the robust independence of the committees. In a parliament where every party was a minority party, the committees, in theory at least, could be powerful bodies holding the executive to account. And by giving committees both a legislative scrutiny and an investigative role, it was thought that a sense of collegiality amongst members would enhance their effectiveness and authority. Arguably, at first, it worked. In these early days, I considered the Scottish Parliament's committee system to be a marked improvement on what I had experienced in the House of Commons. In my experience, all committee members engaged in the process, and whilst ministers often succeeded, nothing could be taken for granted. Very often, a backbench amendment would only be withdrawn on undertakings of further consideration and discussion with the member. That it was a considerable contrast to Westminster as I had known it. That was a considerable contrast to Westminster as I had known it. On several occasions, I was on the receiving end of the committee members' scrutiny, not least Liberal Democrat MSPs asserting their independence from the executive. Admittedly, today, I view from a distance, but I have heard sufficient reports to suggest that in more recent times, such a spirit of committee independence has not been as robust. Dissent from governments supporting members is frowned upon. Going forward, the committees must surely revive their robust and rigorous scrutiny of ministers' actions and legislation, if for no other reason than it can lead to more effective legislation. Virtue signalling is not a good recipe for effective lawmaking. Moreover, it is likely that organisations such as the SCPO can have greater opportunity to shape legislation if the committee members are open to ideas and persuasive argument, rather than being bound by tribal allegiance. Recalling those early years, there were a couple of events which did not fall within the Parliament's remit, but which had a profound effect on us all, and on political debate and dialogue. The attack on the Twin Towers on 9/11 and the Gulf War of 2003. What these events particularly brought to the fore was the need for reassurance of care and inclusion and engagement with people of all faiths, especially Scotland's Muslim communities. The Scottish Executive was determined to try and provide such reassurance and engagement. As Deputy First Minister, I was given the role of visiting places of worship to convey that message. I recall remarking that there was a period of time when I reckoned I'd visited more mosques than churches. I think there was a greater engagement with other faiths, and if SCPO had been established 5 years later, it might well have been sensible for it to be an interfaith as well as interdenominational. Indeed, years later, during the COVID pandemic, the interfaith bonds which had been established allowed both an opportunity to feed mutual concerns into the government, as well as a resource which government could use to disseminate information. And in 2021, during the COP26 in Glasgow, the value of interfaith work allowed much opportunity for common endeavour on such a crucial issue. Surely here, there is an opportunity for further joint development as we look ahead to the next 25 years. A more fundamental challenge to the role of the churches, and the Church of Scotland in particular, was highlighted, I suspect unintentionally, by the words of Donald Dewar, which I've already quoted. Today there is a new voice in the land, the voice of a democratic parliament, a voice to shape Scotland, a voice for the future. For many years, there was a notion that the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland was the closest Scotland came to having its own parliament. The parish-based structure meant that all parts of Scotland could be represented. There was nightly TV coverage, and the church and nation debate could usually be guaranteed to attract much attention in the broadcast and print media. Here was a body debating, sometimes with great vigour, the key issues of their time. But now there was a much more representative body, ironically occupying the very building of the church, the General Assembly, which understandably was attracting much more attention and for more than 1 week per year. To Kirk members, the General Assembly possibly still mattered, even matters, but its impact on the Scottish public and the body politic was undoubtedly diminished. In an important respect, that made the role of the SCPO even more important in ensuring that the voice of faith was and is heard in the public square. But as time has gone on, that role arguably has become more important and necessary. One of the biggest challenges over the years is that whilst in the early years the domestic agenda was to the fore, there is no doubt that in the second half or longer, the debate has been dominated again by the constitutional issue. That poses particular problems for the church and faith groups. In many cases, members are divided on whether Scotland should be independent or not, and even whether there should be a referendum at all. In 2014, the Church of Scotland responded to the challenge in sponsoring a respectful dialogue between the competing sides. And from personal experience, I can say that the debate I took part in with John Swinney under the skilled and watchful eye of the moderator, John Chalmers, was one of the best events I participated in during the referendum campaign. Not only was the debate respectful and didn't descend into cliché and point scoring, but it obliged the participants to be thoughtful about the real strengths of their respective cases. But with divided views within the churches, it has been impossible to carve out a distinctive position on the issue dominating the political agenda, and indeed social media, which represents another major change in the political environment since 1999. But here is surely a challenge and an opportunity. The 20-year anniversary stocktaking by members of the Consultative Steering Group reflected on some of these changes and reported that polarised debate prevents, in our view, proper cross-party working. We do not believe that we were naive in 1998, but we find little reason to be optimistic on this point, as we were back then. The tribalism we have seen has blunted the scrutiny function of the Parliament and has prevented, in most cases, a pluralistic approach to policy scrutiny. On broad areas such as wealth creation and climate change, there can be little that separates the parties, yet we see a reluctance amongst the parties to come together to present a community against the challenges of the world. We went on to reflect that our report envisaged that the Parliament, not just through its committees, should play a key role in the policy development process, as well as scrutinising any legislation subsequently brought forward. In our view, Parliament has not yet reached its potential as a forum for policy development and debate. There is space in the public arena for policy initiatives, and from a church and faith perspective, there is no shortage of pressing issues to investigate and on which to develop ideas. Drug deaths and drug misuse, provision of social care, climate change, tackling poverty, child poverty, and ending energy poverty, immigration and welcoming strangers in our land, the housing crisis and the plight of the homeless, the overcrowding of our prisons and the criminal justice issues generally. addressing the demands of our health service, to name just a few. I know from meeting people, both as a politician and as a former moderator of the General Assembly, that there is real expertise within the churches and other faith groups who can make a significant contribution on these critical issues. And in spite of what a recent Logos poll may have said, my experience as moderator was that political parties and political leaders are willing to engage. I wouldn't want to put words into their mouths, but I suspect that many would welcome others making an informed contribution on issues which address the priorities of our communities. So whilst we could bemoan less TV and media coverage, or a sea change in lobbying practice, which seems to favour the professional over the voluntary, I still believe that there is an important role and an important contribution for our churches and faith communities. And it's not just an opportunity, it's surely a necessity. The exhortation of the Bailey Commission to engage in the political life of the nation is as compelling today as it was in the mid-1940s. May I leave the final word to a former director of the Centre of Theology and Public Issues, Professor Will Storer. In his book, God in Society, published in 2003, shortly before the Scottish Parliament relocated from the General Assembly Hall to its present building, Professor Storer played on the name Holyrood and saw a flash of divine humour. The new Parliament, he said, was to be built on a comic site par excellence, the former site of a brewery bearing the name of a gallows. He continued, the place of Christ's rood, his cross, is the place where we see shockingly juxtaposed God's suffering love for humanity and the terminal violence of the powerful against the innocent. It is a holy place precisely because it is a healing place for a suffering world. Through the resurrection and the sending of the Spirit, the Holy Rood remains a source of hope for humanity. He does go on to say that he would not wish the churches to turn the Scottish Parliament into a moralising arena for political holy willies, or a new theocracy to oppress non-Christians or non-believers. But he did hope that there might be the capacity to bring something of that cruciform holiness to our politics, to our people, and to our small bit of the planet. I say amen to that. That's